All right, so we're going to wrap up the protists here by talking about their ecological role, or what we'll term their niche. What do these guys do in ecosystems? And never say, well, they give us food, they give us medicine, that's not an ecological role or a niche. That's a value we place upon them. But when we talk about the role of protists or any living organism ecologically, we want to focus on how does it interact with the other things in their ecological community. Okay, so some big things we want to remember about protists ecologically. All right, so they're found in a wide diversity of environments. Most of them are marine environments, or most of them will be found in marine-based environments, the ocean. There are freshwater protists, there are soil-based protists, but again, primarily when we discuss this group, they are marine organisms. They can play the role of the symbiont, meaning they work with other organisms. And when we talk about symbiotically, they work together as a team. So we see lots of examples where protists fit that, give us some more room here, that function within ecological communities. So when we say, oh, what does the protist do? Well, they can be producers, they can be consumers, and consumers, omnivores, herbivores, carnivores. They can be decomposers. I'm just going to say, etc. They kind of serve all sorts of different ecological roles. So again, the goal here is to understand their importance and their value and what they do ecologically. Some of the symbiotic relationships, they often provide a benefit to the host. So we talked about some examples. Oh. So we talked about the dinoflagellates and coral. Well, all these little red dots or pinkish dots here, those are dinoflagellates inside of the coral polyp here. There's your coral polyp. So that's a huge benefit. They run photosynthesis and provide the coral polyp with, it's estimated, about 95, 97% of the coral polyp's energy. So an incredibly important ecological role. We talked about the wood digesting protists. That break down cellulose in the gut of termites. So they help break down the cellulose, and then the bacteria inside the protist further degrades or digests the cellulose, making it available as a source of energy. Unfortunately, there are some parasitic protists. We talked about those guys. They cause different diseases. They can cause problems with red tide that can lead to fish kills, decomposition. Now, decomposition can go both directions. Ecologically, it's a good thing because it helps break down and recycle nutrients. But if they're decomposing tissue on a living organism, no, that's not such a good thing at all. So again, certain ones fit into that ecological category. And then we talked about all the different photosynthetic ones. And big red star here on this, red. What I want you guys to associate, which pigment is associated with the different protists that we're looking at. So there you go, color that in. So what pigment is connected to the green algae, the brown algae, the red algae, etc. Go back, review that, make sure you have some familiarity and comfort with that one. So, all right, so to wrap all this up, I'll show you guys kind of the ecological food chain of protists in the ocean here. So you got all sorts of producers, the producer base in the ocean. By and large, the producer base of the ocean are going to be algae. We have very few plants that can actually live in salt water. So there's a handful, and we'll get into those later in the semester. But by and large, your producer base in the ocean, or most aquatic ecosystems, are algae. There are some prokaryotic producers, cyanobacteria, etc. But really it's the protists. The protists are the base of the food chain. They then get eaten by plankton. We call it zooplankton, was kind of the general term. Oh, that's supposed to be an O. Zooplankton. The ones that directly eat the producers are herbivores. Those are then eaten by the carnivores. Sometimes there's omnivore plankton that will eat both producer and consumers. But this energy is directed up to these herbivore or herbivorous plankton groups. They then provide food going up to the next level in the food chain, whether it's the carnivore plankton or up to the small crustaceans that get eaten by the fish that work their way up to the orca, etc. But these guys play an incredibly important role. So a huge challenge here is what would happen to global food chains in the ocean if protists were to decline in numbers. So I want you to think about that. And then here's the reality. Climate change. That's supposed to say climate change. Climate change is causing problems here because the temperature of the ocean is going up. So the temperature of the ocean is increasing. So what happens is the carnivorous plankton trigger their population growth based on temperature. So they need a certain water temperature and their population starts growing. Well, as ocean temperatures go up, their population starts growing. The problem is the protists, the producer base, isn't increasing their population because they're not strictly tied to temperature. They also need sunlight. So traditionally what would happen, this is going to be time on the bottom, or we would say seasons. The protist population would do this, and it'd go up. The carnivore population would do this. It lagged behind, and then once there was enough protists, then their population would start to grow because there's enough food for the carnivores to eat, or the herbivores to eat, and the plankton to eat the producer base. Well, our problem now is that, I'm going to do dashed lines, this population is doing this. And it's not sustainable because they don't have any food to eat, because the algae and the protist producers are not increasing their population prior to the carnivorous, whether it's the herbivores or carnivores, prior to their population going up. So then this leads to a crash in the population size of the herbivore and carnivore plankton, which then reduces food for everything above them in the food chain. So we see some food chains being disrupted significantly because of what climate change is doing to the earth. So we will come back to this concept later in the semester, Want to just start to introduce it now, but we'll definitely get into it in more detail throughout other units of the semester. How is climate change impacting the Earth? Okay, so that wraps up all of the Protist information. I encourage you guys, go back, do the review slides right now. Take 5 minutes, see if you can knock out all those review slides. If not, look up the answers to the review slides. Make sure you're comfortable with that information. All right, so once we're done with protists, we're then going to progress our way into fungi and check out that group.